In the heart of the Middle Ages, justice was not a matter of fairness or truth. It was a theater of fear and pain where the powerful controlled the weak through cruelty. Torture was not hidden in dark rooms. It was carried out in open squares where entire crowds gathered to witness the slow breaking of the human body. The rulers of the time believed that pain could reveal truth, that screams could serve as proof of guilt, and that suffering was the most effective way to keep people obedient. Torture was not simply a punishment. It was a performance designed to remind everyone of the cost of defiance. Imagine the silence of the town square broken by the sound of iron chains, the cries of a victim stretching into the night, and the sight of devices, created not for healing or work, but for the sole purpose of tearing apart flesh and crushing bone. This was medieval justice, and today we uncover 10 of the most horrifying torture devices ever used. To understand why these devices were created, we need to look at the world of the Middle Ages, a time when law, religion, and power were deeply connected, and where cruelty was often seen as necessary. Courts did not value evidence as we do today. They relied on confessions, and when a person refused to speak, torture became the method to force the truth out. Religion played an even greater role, since the church believed the soul was more important than the body, and suffering in this life could save someone from eternal damnation. Priests often stood by as people screamed, telling the crowd that pain would cleanse sin and that torment was better than burning in hell forever. Torture was also political because rulers understood that fear was the strongest weapon they had. A single public punishment could silence hundreds. A single execution could keep entire villages obedient, and the memory of screams could last longer than any written law. Ordinary people accepted this cruelty, some out of fear, others out of fascination, gathering in squares to watch bodies break and blood spill. It was both warning and entertainment, a daily reminder that power belonged to those who controlled pain. But the stories are not enough. The real horror lies in the devices themselves, and now we will look at the 10 most terrifying of them all. First, the rack. The rack is perhaps the most infamous torture device of the medieval world, a symbol of pain so extreme that even its name brings fear. It was built as a large wooden frame with rollers at both ends, and ropes tied to the wrists and ankles of the victim. Once secured, the executioner would slowly turn the rollers, stretching the body inch by inch until the joints cracked and muscles tore apart. The horror of the rack was not only in the unbearable pain, but also in the slow pace because each turn of the handle forced bones out of their sockets, making the victim feel as if the body was being pulled in 2 directions at once. Witnesses described the sound of ligaments snapping, the sight of limbs lengthening unnaturally, and the screams that echoed beyond prison walls. Many victims did not die on the rack. Instead, they were left permanently crippled, unable to walk or use their arms, serving as living warnings of what happened to those who defied authority. The rack was not only about destroying the body, it was about breaking the spirit, showing that no one could resist the power of those who controlled the wheel. Second, the Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is one of the most terrifying torture devices ever imagined. A tall coffin made of metal, often shaped like a standing human figure, its inside lined with sharp iron spikes. The victim was forced to step inside, and once the heavy doors closed, the spikes drove deep into the flesh, piercing arms, legs, and torso, but carefully avoiding the heart and other vital organs so that death would not come quickly. This device was not designed to kill instantly. It was meant to prolong agony, trapping the victim in darkness where every small movement drove the spikes deeper and made the wounds bleed further. The sound of the doors closing was said to terrify not only the victim, but also those who witnessed it, because everyone knew that once inside, there was no escape except through hours or even days of suffering. Stories tell us that some Iron Maidens were even built with small holes that allowed blood to drain onto the ground, turning the floor beneath it into a gruesome pool. Whether all of these tales are fully true or partly legend, the Iron Maiden became a lasting symbol of medieval cruelty, where death itself was considered too merciful compared to the slow torment of bleeding inside iron walls. Third, the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was one of the most brutal public torture devices of the medieval era. A massive wooden wheel mounted high so that entire crowds could see what happened to the condemned. The victim was tied across the wheel, arms and legs spread wide, while the executioner struck with heavy iron bars, shattering bones one by one, beginning with the limbs and often saving the chest and skull for last, so that the person remained alive as long as possible. The body twisted unnaturally as bones snapped, the cries echoing through the square, while onlookers watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. After the blows were finished, the broken figure was often left tied to the wheel, exposed to the burning sun, the freezing night air, or the crows that circled overhead, waiting to feed on open wounds. Death did not always come quickly, for some victims lingered in agony for hours, even days, slowly succumbing to shock, dehydration, or infection. The wheel was not only a method of punishment, it was a warning carved into the memory of every villager who saw it, a reminder that rebellion or betrayal would end with the body crushed and displayed for all to witness. Fourth, the thumbscrew. The thumbscrew was small compared to other torture machines, yet its size made it no less terrifying, because this simple device could crush bone and flesh with unbearable pain. It was built with two flat metal or wooden plates joined by a screw, and the victim's fingers or thumbs were placed between them. As the screw was tightened, the plates pressed closer together, splintering nails, breaking joints, and grinding delicate bones into fragments. What made the thumbscrew especially effective was its ability to extract confessions quickly, because even the strongest soldiers and the most defiant prisoners could not withstand the sensation of their own hands being slowly destroyed. It was portable, cheap, and easy to use, which meant it could be employed anywhere, from castle dungeons to battlefield camps, turning ordinary interrogations into scenes of horror. Victims often fainted from the pain, yet the device rarely killed, leaving prisoners alive but permanently disfigured, their mangled fingers serving as a constant reminder of the power that had been used against them. Unlike larger machines that needed space and preparation, the thumbscrew required little effort, making it one of the most feared tools of everyday justice in the medieval world. 5. The Heretic's Fork. The Heretic's Fork was a deceptively simple device, yet it brought with it a form of torture that was both agonizing and humiliating. It was a small metal rod fitted with two sharp prongs at each end. One pointed upward and pressed beneath the chin. The other pointed downward and pressed into the upper chest or just above the sternum. Once strapped tightly around the neck with leather bands, the fork forced the victim to keep the head upright at all times. The cruelty of this device came from its endurance rather than immediate pain, because every attempt to rest, lower the head, or even fall asleep would drive the spikes deeper into the flesh, causing sharp wounds and constant bleeding. Victims were left wearing the fork for hours or even days, denied the relief of closing their eyes or bowing their heads, tormented by exhaustion that grew worse with every moment. The heretic's fork was often used against those accused of heresy or blasphemy, ensuring that the punishment not only inflicted suffering, but also served as a public sign of guilt. It was designed to break both the body and the dignity of the person, forcing them to endure pain in silence, while marked forever as an enemy of faith and authority. Sixth, the chair of torture. The chair of torture was one of the most intimidating instruments ever created, not only because of the pain it caused, but also because of the fear it inspired before the victim even sat upon it. The chair was usually made of solid wood or iron, and its surface was covered with hundreds of sharp spikes on the seat, the backrest, the armrests, and even the leg supports. Once the victim was placed on the chair, leather straps or iron clamps held the body tightly against the spikes, pressing them deep into the flesh. Struggling only made it worse, because every movement caused the spikes to dig further, piercing skin and muscle from every angle. In some cases, fires were lit beneath the chair, heating the iron until the spikes became red hot, burning into the body while still tearing at the flesh. This device was not always used to kill, but rather to force confessions or to serve as a public display of suffering. The victim, covered in blood and burns, would often survive the experience, but remain scarred and weakened for life. The chair stood as a symbol of power, reminding onlookers that pain could be inflicted at any time, with no escape once the straps were fastened. Seventh, the pair of anguish. The pair of anguish was a device that struck fear even before it was used, for its very shape revealed the cruelty of its purpose. Made of metal and resembling a pear with a screw at one end, it consisted of 4 curved leaves or petals that could be forced open wider and wider as the screw was turned. The device was inserted into the mouth, the ear, or in more horrific cases into other body cavities. And once in place, the torturer slowly twisted the screw, causing the metal leaves to spread apart. As they opened, they tore through flesh, ruptured muscles, and shattered delicate tissue, creating wounds so severe that many victims bled to death or died from shock. Unlike other torture tools, the pair of anguish was not meant to extract confessions, but to punish and humiliate. It was often used against women accused of witchcraft, against people accused of blasphemy, or against those whose crimes were seen as especially shameful. The agony it caused was beyond description, and even when death did not come immediately, the injuries left behind were permanent and devastating. This cruel device showed the darkest extremes of human imagination, turning a simple object into a weapon of unbearable torment. Eighth, the Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull was one of the most horrifying inventions of the ancient world, a device that combined cruelty with a sense of theatrical spectacle. It was built as a large hollow statue of a bull, cast from solid bronze, with a door in its side where the victim was forced inside. Once the door was sealed, a fire was lit beneath the belly of the bull, and as the metal grew hotter and hotter, the person trapped within was slowly roasted alive. The design was created to intensify not only the suffering of the victim, but also the experience of those who watched. Pipes were fitted inside the head of the bull, and as the victim screamed in agony, the sound echoed through the channels and emerged from the bull's mouth as terrifying roars. To the crowd gathered outside, it seemed as if the bull itself had come alive, bellowing in fury as flames consumed the body within. Death inside the Brazen Bull was slow, cruel, and unforgettable. Skin burned, lungs filled with smoke, and the body eventually collapsed into charred remains while the audience looked on. This device revealed the darkest side of power, where human suffering was turned into performance and death itself became entertainment. Ninth, the Scavenger's Daughter. The Scavenger's Daughter was a device designed to crush the human body into itself, a grim counterpart to the rack which stretched its victims apart. Made of iron and shaped like a looped frame, it forced the prisoner into a kneeling position, pressing the head down toward the knees while the metal frame clamped tightly around the back and shoulders. As the device was locked in place, the body folded unnaturally, ribs pressed against lungs, blood surged into the head, and breathing became painfully restricted. Veins swelled, eyes bulged, and in some cases blood even poured from the nose and ears as pressure built within the skull. Unlike torture that ripped flesh or shattered bones with blows, this method suffocated slowly. The Scavenger's Daughter was often used as a method of interrogation, since the unbearable pressure quickly wore down resistance and forced confessions, even if they were false. Victims who survived were left weak, dizzy, and often permanently damaged. This device was feared not for visible wounds, but for the silent agony it inflicted, a crushing weight that turned the body into its own prison, leaving nothing but exhaustion and despair. 10th, the executioner's axe and block. The executioner's axe and block might seem simple compared to the machines of spikes and screws, yet in medieval times, even this method of death often turned into torture. The condemned was led to a wooden block, forced to kneel, and told to rest the neck upon it while the executioner raised a heavy axe above his head. In theory, one swift strike should have brought an end to life, but in practice the outcome was often far more gruesome. Axes were heavy and unwieldy, and the men who used them were not always skilled. A nervous executioner or a poorly sharpened blade could mean 2 or 3 blows before death, each strike cutting deeper but failing to sever the head completely. The victim screamed, the crowd roared, and the moment stretched into a spectacle of horror rather than a merciful ending. For nobles and monarchs, this final act became public theater, where dignity could be destroyed by a trembling hand. Even when the blade found its mark, the fear leading up to that instant, the sound of the axe slicing the air, and the silence that followed all combined to make execution by axe one of the most dreaded punishments of the medieval world. The true power of medieval torture was not only in the damage it did to the body, but in the fear it carved into the minds of all who saw it. Every device, from the rack to the axe, was a message written in pain, warning people that disobedience would be punished with suffering beyond imagination. Torture was designed to break more than bones. It was made to crush the spirit of entire communities. When a prisoner screamed on the wheel or burned inside the Brazen Bull, it was not only the victim who suffered. The crowd that watched carried the memory home, and that memory became a weapon stronger than steel. Parents told their children the stories, neighbors whispered about the executions, and whole towns lived under a shadow of dread. The fear of torture kept people obedient long before a crime was even committed. There was also the psychological torment of anticipation, because the moment a sentence was passed, the victim already began to suffer in the imagination, picturing the iron spikes, the crushing screws, or the fire waiting at the stake. In many cases, fear itself was as effective as the torture, for it made people confess before the first tool was even lifted. In this way, pain ruled both body and mind. Over time, the use of torture began to decline, not because the devices became less effective, but because society slowly started to question whether such cruelty had any place in justice. As Europe entered the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, new ideas about law, reason, and human rights began to spread, and philosophers argued that truth could not be found through pain, because a person in agony would confess to anything simply to make the suffering end. Legal systems gradually shifted toward evidence and testimony rather than forced confessions, and rulers began to see that torture often created more problems than it solved. The church, too, which had once defended the practice as a way to save souls, eventually distanced itself as moral thinkers condemned it as a violation of the human spirit. Nations that prided themselves on order and progress found it increasingly difficult to justify burning, stretching, and breaking people in public squares. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many European countries had outlawed torture, replacing it with prisons and other forms of punishment. The gruesome devices were destroyed or locked away, some preserved in museums as chilling reminders of the past. Though torture has not vanished from the world, its decline in Europe marked a turning point when cruelty began to give way, at least in principle, to the idea of justice built on dignity and law rather than fear and pain. We have now walked through 10 of the most horrifying torture devices of the medieval world, each one a creation of human hands, yet each one a reminder of how far cruelty can go when fear becomes the foundation of power. The rack stretched bodies until they tore apart, the Iron Maiden pierced with silent agony, the breaking wheel shattered bones before a watching crowd, and the Brazen Bull turned death into performance. Even the smaller devices like the thumbscrew and the Heretic S-fork brought suffering that lived on long after the wounds had healed. Together, they show us that torture was not only about punishment, it was about control, about keeping whole societies silent through fear, about reminding people that pain awaited those who dared to resist. Though centuries have passed, and though these devices now sit behind glass in museums, their presence forces us to ask difficult questions about cruelty, justice, and the thin line between authority and abuse. If this journey has left you unsettled, that is exactly what history should do, because it is only by facing the darkness of the past that we understand the value of the progress we have today. If you want to discover more untold stories of human history, the shocking, the hidden, and the unforgettable, then make sure to stay with this channel, because the past still has many secrets waiting to be uncovered.